Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to the St. Mary's County Library program, Covered Bridges, Not Just Pretty Artifacts. And my name is Allison, and I work for St. Mary's County Library. All right, and our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. He's going to be the one giving our presentation and going over some slides. And take it away, Jim.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. And let's get this puppy up. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Does that look right?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, good.
Great.
So, before I get going this evening, I'll make a few remarks about why I wanted to talk about covered bridges. First of all, I like bridges, and I deal with actually not so much covered bridges, but in the past I've dealt mostly with the various sorts of steel through truss bridges and suspension bridges, and maybe some future talk will deal with those. I'll point out I have no training in engineering, and so I'm going to be talking a little bit about tension and compression, but in a very general way. Looking more at how these bridges are designed and why people chose to use them in certain circumstances. I thought it interesting to share with folks because, first of all, you think archaeology, you think of us digging stuff up. Well, archaeology looks at the past largely through material remains. It doesn't have to be buried. And I've spoken before about cemeteries. I mean, those gravestones above ground, what we can learn from them. We can learn something from bridges too. And the neat thing about that for a wide audience is that anybody can do it. You don't need a special permit. Generally, you don't need any permission. If you want to study covered bridges or steel through truss bridges or a variety, one-room schoolhouses, a variety of different type features on the landscape, you could do it on your own. And a lot of it can be done online, looking at identifying these sites, looking at their history, kind of drilling down on them and getting information and looking for patterns. And, it's for me, that's an interesting way of doing research on material culture, and you don't need a large number of people to help you out. You can do it by yourself. You don't need any particular training, although you may want to consult with somebody who does this kind of work. So anyway, I thought, I'd talk a little bit about covered bridges and maybe in the process dispel some preconceptions that some people have about them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trusses, not that kind. A truss is basically a series of triangles for the most part that help support structure, that help deal with stresses, compression and tension mostly. If you live in sort of a conventional house with an attic, go up in the attic, and what are you going to see? You're going to see a bunch of roof trusses. These are essentially the rafters that hold up your roof. Going to look at some very simple ones, and then what I think are perhaps more interesting are the various sorts of designed trusses and those that were actually patented. We'll look a little bit at the covering of bridges and a little bit about abutments and piers. Want to look at where are they built? And towards the end of the talk, you'll see a map showing the distribution, at least of known covered bridges today. And I think you might be surprised at how they're distributed across the landscape. Want to look at when they were built. I'll let the cat out of the bag here. Covered bridges aren't necessarily that old. In fact, many of those that survive were, if not built in the 20th century, were heavily rebuilt in the 20th century. And then getting into more of my general interest in bridges is that for me, the questions are, who decided to build a particular kind of bridge in a particular place at a particular time? When you look at a structure like that and you start asking those questions, you really get into some interesting history. A bridge just doesn't go up willy-nilly. There's there are two sides of usually a river, and why does somebody want to connect them? What's important about connecting the two sides? And then finally, a little bit about what ended what we might call the covered bridge era. So here we go. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to shout them out, and I will try to address them. So here's, kind of a classic covered bridge. Actually, it's a fairly large one, fairly long one down in Georgia. And it's in fact associated with a mill, which isn't unusual. You can see, because you build dams for mills, and that creates a nice place to build a bridge because you're creating conditions that allow easy construction of the piers that go into the river. But a lot of the bridges going to be talking about don't have those piers set in a river. They're shorter spans, and so they have an abutment on each side and no piers in the middle. It's a single span. This bridge has 3 spans. And of course, it's covered. And it has a window in it. We'll talk about those things as I go along. In terms of guides on bridges, there's all kinds of books on them. Eric Sloan, who was a great illustrator on colonial era artifacts. His American Barns and Covered Bridges is an excellent source to go to. Online, you can find the one in the middle here, Covered Bridges and the Birth of American Engineering. Download it as a PDF. Wonderful piece of work, lots of detail. And then Richard Sanders Allen, this fellow here on the right, Covered Bridges of the Northeast. Allen has written books on covered bridges of the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, the Southeast, I think the Midwest. He's got a series of these things. And they show you a nice selection of the different bridge types and some data on them. Another source, which you can find easily online at lostbridges.org. And this is a database, and you can go in and type in information.
Lost?
Barbara, could you mute yours?
Yes.
Thank you. If my dogs start barking, I'm going to have to mute on this side. It's going to be a very interesting talk. This is a great website. You can just plug in names and look at different bridges and see what kind of data they have on them. And if you were going to do some research on bridges of a particular area, particular region, this would be a pretty good place to start. You get some basics on them, and then you use other sources to kind of drill down and look at this, who built these bridges, who designed them, what details can we get on them, and who funded the construction of that bridge, and why they put it at that particular place. So this is a nice place to start if one were to do a study of covered bridges, which could easily be a master's thesis in anthropology or history. One of the great points that Eric Sloan makes in his book is that they might all look alike, but they aren't. There's a lot of variability in these bridges. And in science, and archaeology is a science, variability is really what we're looking for. If everything looked alike, if all schoolhouses looked alike, if all covered bridges looked alike, if all 17th century plantation sites looked alike, then there'd be no point in digging more than one of them. The interesting information comes out of the variability. Why are they different? What's that range of variability, and what does that variability mean? And so Eric Sloan, essentially an illustrator and sort of an amateur historian, understood that. So how are they built? Well, basically, I'm going to give you a quick primer on bridge terminology. The lower right-hand corner, you see what looks like stone, and this is supposed to be a bridge abutment. It's built into the bank of a creek, and that supports one side of the bridge. You'll have an abutment on the other side. And if the creek is wide enough, you'll need more than one span, so there'll be stone or some sort of masonry piers usually in the middle. You don't usually see trestle work. You don't usually see wooden timbers holding up the middle of covered bridges. They just wouldn't last very long. And I can get into that later on about why that's so. But you can see along the lower right hand, this diagonal line here, we've got several boards put together. That's a lower chord, as in a chord in music. So you have lower chords, two of them, and you have two upper ones in the case of covered bridges. And the truss work is really what connects those two pairs of chords. You have sort of a horizontal trussing above and below, and I'm not really going to talk about that. You have the vertical, which is what bridge people usually look at. And so you've got a series of verticals and diagonals that help distribute the stresses across a bridge. Think of a thin plastic ruler, 12 inches long. And you can support it on two books, some stacks of books, 8 inches apart. If you push your hand down on that plastic ruler around 6 inches, it deflects. If you keep pushing it down, it will either snap or it'll just slide off the piles of books, which would be the abutments. And the same thing happens if you roll your finger or roll a heavy object along that plastic ruler from one end to the other, that plastic ruler will begin to deflect differentially across its length. The idea of trusses is they help distribute those stresses so that the stress, that pressure is diverted out to the abutments and into the ground rather than the cords taking the full load. So it basically gives structure to the bridge. It allows it to bear a large static load, that is a certain amount of weight just sitting there. And it also allows it to deal with dynamic loads. So if you took a truck and drove it across a bridge, that's a dynamic load. And it's created from the speed of the truck and its weight. And as it rolls across that bridge sort of deflects. It just down the length of the cords, it deflects. If that truck is too heavy, as going too fast, the truss work will not be able to respond quickly enough to those stresses, and the bridge will fall apart. This happened a lot in the past. A lot of covered bridges have been lost because vehicles, usually trucks, that are too big and just smash into these things, or are moving at too high a speed with too heavy a load.
Yeah.
The other major sources of destruction of bridges are vandalism, people setting them afire.
Oh my God.
And somebody still has their, should mute because we're picking up your background noises. So people burning them down just for giggles. And also just floods and ice flows will take out a bridge. So there are a variety of different trusses, and if you're interested in pursuing this kind of research, finding these charts is really easy. They're all over the place. The simplest kind of bridge is a simple beam bridge, which is basically a plank, a board, or whatever, or two of them laid down across two abutments. It's just flat. And of course, you're limited by the length of the wood and by the amount of deflection of that piece of wood as you move things across. So these trusses are designed to allow these bridges to carry heavier loads and to cross increasingly longer distances. And I'll show you pictures of all these. The king post is simple. It's just a single post with two braces, and along the bottom is the cord. You'd find these across very small expanses, a single king post of, maybe 20 feet at most. A queen post is just two king posts, that's all. But it does allow you to span wider distances. And then a multiple king post is basically just a variation on a theme, just multiple vertical posts with those diagonals. And you'll see a number of images showing that. So those are the basic, truss types that have been around for many centuries. It's the second group below. These are actually patented trusses. These were developed by individuals. They were invented and then patented through the U.S. Patent Office. The first one there, the Burr arch, is actually a Burr arch with multiple king posts. So they took king posts and they put in this laminated wooden arch, actually two of them, usually two of them. And with that arch, you think of something moving across that bridge. There's a lot of weight, and these vertical posts will then be intentional. So kind of pull down the upper chord. These diagonal ones will change that into compression, so they'll apply pressure down to the bottom chord again. But a lot of the weight and a lot of the dynamic loading is borne by that arch. And the arch goes down below the chord and actually tucks into the abutment. So a lot of that weight is being taken up by that pre-stressed arch and conveyed directly into the abutment and into the earthwork. So the king posts are providing stability and rigidity to the bridge, but it's the arch that deals with most of the dynamic loading. The lattice work, the Towne lattice, you'll see some pictures of that. That's one of the early inventions in bridge making, and it's lattice work, that's all. It's just a series of fairly light wooden members with a lot of them that really kind of distributes the stresses across the length of the bridge. The long one you'll see a little bit later. It's just, again, a little bit of a variation on the theme with verticals and crosses. And then the Howe bridge is in the lower left-hand corner is one of the more interesting innovations because you've got these wooden X's, right? And these lighter vertical lines aren't timbers at all. They're iron rods and they're adjustable. And wrought iron, does very nicely under tension. Doesn't handle compression very well. The wooden members deal with compression very nicely. So the two work in tandem to basically convey those stresses to the abutments and to provide rigidity to the bridge. Let's see what else I have here. Oh, and here's some, these are considered significant regional types, the Smith and Paddleford. I'll mention a couple of those. I'll show you some pictures of those. And I'm not going to bother too much about most of the other ones below. You just don't see that many of them. And if you do see one in the wild, with covered bridges, there's almost always an interpretive sign that goes with them because they're fairly unusual. So if one survives, there's usually somebody who's going to put a sign up on it. Maybe it's a National Park Service type thing. Maybe it's just a wooden plaque on the bridge, whatever, but there'll be some descriptive material. I do have one example of an inverted bowstring. So here's a simple, in the upper left-hand corner, that's your simple bridge. That's called a simple beam bridge. Sloan doesn't use that terminology, but that's what it is. And then below that, he's got this king post truss where the trusses are actually enclosed. They're covered in some sort of clapboard to essentially weatherproof them. Number 2 in the right-hand corner, that's a simple king post. Again, the same as number 3, except it's all exposed to the weather. And here we've got a king post, lower right-hand corner. That's the massive king post there with 2 braces and some counter braces as well. So that's a pretty substantial truss for a bridge. It would be very sturdy, but again, you're limited by the length of the span. If you have a long distance to cover, if you have a truss type that will allow you to expand to cover that distance with one span, that's great. Otherwise, you need to go through the expense of building a pier in the middle of the river. And of course, once you put a pier in a river, it's vulnerable to damage, possibly by boat traffic, possibly by ice flows in the spring, and sometimes just floodwaters. For those of you who've been watching the events in Baltimore Harbor with the loss of the King Bridge, you know, if that were a suspension bridge, it never would have happened because there wouldn't be any piers in navigable water. You might have piers that go in the water, but they'd be in very shallow water. The piers for the Key Bridge were in or immediately next to navigable water for large ships. So they were sitting ducks. And just as sort of a side note, generally on each side of the bridges today, there's what we call a dolphin, usually some sort of masonry structure, nowadays mostly concrete, but just sort of a cylinder or just a big oblong structure that if anything's heading for a bridge pier, that vessel or that ice will hit that dolphin first and break up. Okay. So here's a classic queen post bridge. Again, here we have two verticals. Actually, you could have multiple. You've got braces on each side and counter braces. They connect, again, they connect the lower cord with the upper cord. That upper cord helps distribute the weight and energy of objects crossing the bridge. And here's the Burr arch truss. If you travel around southeastern Pennsylvania, New York, New England, there's quite a few of these that survive. They're really impressive. And we actually have one I'll show you towards the end here in Maryland. But it's not a piece of wood that's bent. It's laminate. It's a laminar structure. So there's a number of boards kind of sandwiched and put under stress so you get that nice arch there. And although we're looking inside the bridge here, you see they come down to the floor. Actually, they extend below the floor. And again, they go right into the abutment. So a lot of that weight on the bridge is being transferred via that arch to the abutments. So the Burr arch truss was an important early innovation, and the Towne truss was the other major innovation. And you'll see a lot of those bridges that survive today, many of them are one of these two types, sometimes actually a combination of them. But again, it's a simple lattice work. The boards, actually, this is a little more than simple. It just has two. But you can see it's pinned together at the interstices. So they're just boring a hole through a board, running a wooden dowel through it, maybe about 1.5 inches in diameter. And that not only keeps those diagonals together, keeps them from moving apart, but it also gives it a little bit of a scissor action. So this is wood. It needs to move a little bit with changing humidity. And of course, the stress is on that bridge. So it actually gives the wood a little bit of give, and that helps keep it from racking and falling apart. Ithiel Towne's, and no, I don't have a lisp. The patentee for this is a guy named Ithiel Towne, Ithiel. He originally patented in 1820, and then took out a second patent where instead of just having two cords, as you can see in the lower left, added another pair. His patents do not survive, I don't think. The patent office all burned up, I think, in 1836. So we don't have any patents from 1790 to 1836, unless the holder of the patent refiled it with the patent office after the fire. We don't have an actual text and drawing for it. The Howe truss, again, is an interesting one because what Howe did was he's got this sort of scissor type approach with the wooden timbers, And he's got those iron rods, and those iron rods are really important for suspension. And they work so well that when railroad bridges were needed, how truss was often used for the early railroads, and then modified where you just got rid of all the timber and just everything was made of iron, either wrought iron, a combination of wrought iron and cast iron. So here's a nice example of a king post truss. You'll notice the covering does not go all the way up to the upper cord. There's a space here, sort of like a window. Probably not necessary for the Pine Brook Bridge because it's fairly short. But the thing about covered bridges, if they're really long, is that if you don't have windows, they're really dark. It's like going into, a dark tunnel. And for the most part, that was not a good idea. You wanted to be able to see where you're going. On the other hand, for people having romantic trysts, the covered bridges were a great place to go for a little bit of heavy necking, because it was nice and dark. And if anybody was approaching, because it's sort of this dark tunnel type thing, you could see them from a distance, and they couldn't really see you. They could see sort of an outline, but they wouldn't see what you're up to. So much of our nation may have been born on covered bridges. I don't know. I don't know anybody who's done a study of it. The Flint Bridge, I've got a note on that. Oh, one of the things I wanted to point out with this one is it looks like a simple king post. Sometimes hard to tell. It's really hard to photograph bridge interiors. But it looks like a simple king post truss bridge. But the dates on it are 1845 or 1874. And the issue with bridges is that often they needed to be rebuilt because of some damage done to them. And often people didn't keep very good records on this sort of thing. Or if it was a county that was maintaining a bridge, assuming its records survived, it's not clear that whether the bridge was being entirely rebuilt or if it was being heavily remodeled. So there's often questions about dates. But look at those dates, 1845, 1870, that's not particularly early. And the previous bridge here, 1872, and they get later than that. So we tend to, a lot of folks, when they see these things, they think of, oh, the colonial era and all that. And I don't know of a surviving colonial era bridge in the United States. And it may be that there were more of them and we've lost them, but I think it's more likely that these bridges are really a phenomenon of the 19th century. Here's an interesting arrangement where you've got a Towne lattice truss with extra cords. So you go up the secondary cords. You can see this one here, and then the one above, and it has a Burr arch in it as well. And you can't really see it from the photograph because of the lighting, but this is laminated. This is a whole bunch of boards. This always reminds me of what engineers like to say when they really like to cover the bases. They're belt and suspenders kind of guys, They wear belts and suspenders just in case. Well, this bridge is a little bit like belt and suspenders. But the thing is, the original Towne Truss Bridge was built in 1829. Nearly a century later, the bridge was restored by adding that Burr arch into it. And my guess is that's because it's 1922 and people are starting to drive automobiles. And they're going to be heavier than a lot of wagons. And they're going to be moving at higher speeds across the bridge. And again, there's a static load where you just put weight on a bridge. And there's a dynamic load where you take that weight and move it at a certain speed. The higher the speed and the heavier the load, the more stress there is on the bridge. The bridge physically cannot respond to that rolling load as quickly as, say, an iron bridge could. And so that becomes a problem. I don't want to say anything about that. This is an example of, kind of, I guess you would call it king post. As you can see, the vertical post and the braces. So there's multiple king posts plus an arch. And this arch, it looks a lot lighter than the one we just saw. The other interesting thing about it, though, is that there's something off to the right. Here's the arch. But what's going on over here? There are some bridges where there's a separate pedestrian way. It's not that common that I've seen, but a separate pedestrian way from the main vehicular lane. And there are also what we call double barrel covered bridges where you almost, there's always a Burr arch with that. So there'll be three of those arches and there'll be essentially two lanes with one arch, that third arch in the middle. So it separates traffic. And you would do that for a bridge that sustains a fairly heavy traffic load. Burr arch, king post. What's wrong with this picture? If you look towards the lower left-hand corner, there's a reflection. This isn't the bridge. This is an aqueduct. It's part of a canal. And most folks don't think about it, because most folks nowadays don't think about canals, but what happens when you have to make your canal go over another body of water? More often than not, at least in the eastern United States, they build these large, massive aqueducts on Roman models. But in some cases, they built essentially a covered bridge with a bed that could sustain, probably 4 feet deep, the water would be. I've never actually seen one of these. I've only seen photographs. I think it'd be a real kicker to take a canal boat through, or even a canoe, just to experience it. Swan Bridge. I'm not sure how much of this is an optical illusion created by the lens of the camera, because it does look kind of rhomboidal in section, but it's a classic sort of second generation town truss bridge with, although in this case, I only see one secondary chord, not two. Have a note on that? Oh, two interesting notes on this. First of all, it was built in 1933. Who'd have thought? Second of all, it's three spans that cover 320 feet, so longer than a football field. But a single span town truss bridge could not do that. It's just too long a distance. So they needed three spans. So there've got to be two piers set into the water. Cornish-Windsor Bridge. It's two spans and a total of each span is a little bit over 200 feet. So that's a really long town truss bridge. That's over the Connecticut River, which is a substantial body of water. This one actually looks like it's not paved, it's a wooden deck. Oh, the reason I pull this one out, this is a different kind of patent. This is a long truss patent. And it's not because the truss is long, but the military officer who designed it, his name was Long. Long is credited with developing the first truss bridge that's actually based on mathematics, where he was actually calculating stresses and using an appropriate number of trusses, appropriate amount of wood to sustain those weights, and probably a little bit extra. Engineers always add extra. I don't know what their error factor is. So, it's still not all that different from the earlier king post truss bridges, except it's got these counter braces, and it's sort of a web where there are actually, think of it as three different layers to this web. So we've got a frame member here, one coming down in between the second one over here. And like Ithiel Towne's second patent, it has that secondary truss on it, which has a bunch of graffiti on, which I didn't notice before. That's another issue with covered bridges. It tends to be graffiti, they tend to attract graffiti. Yep, come on, you. And this is the Howe Truss Bridge, Howe. And again, it's got those iron bars that come down in between each of these panels. And again, it's a triple web here. You've got three, sort of like three different layers of webbing. This is often used for, was often used for railroad bridges, but that iron allowed it to sustain a lot of weight and movement. The iron was much, the wrought iron reacted more quickly and, let's say, more assertively, if you will, to large, heavy loads moving at speed. And that's why they were, it was adapted for railroad bridge construction. It's 4 spans for a total of almost 400 feet. So here on the left is an example of it being used for a railroad. If you look at the bottom there, I mean, you can see it's got railroad tracks up in New Hampshire. A lot of these covered bridges used for railroads tended to be special use railroads for the lumber industry or for mining. In fact, the Pratt Truss on the right in New Hampshire, I think, was for the granite industry, but it also sustained a railroad, a small gauge railroad. Oh, I have a spelling error in there. Okay. This is a Smith Truss Bridge. You see these mostly in on the West Coast. I don't know of any examples in the Eastern United States. The fellow who patented this truss lived and worked on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington area. And this is the same Smith truss, except again, he's tripled it up. You can see kind of 3 layers of trussing there. Again, for a railroad to sustain those heavy moving loads. Now, I'm sure I've told you folks this before, or at least some of you. When I was an undergraduate, I had a cultural anthropology professor. His name was David Hicks. He was a Brit, Cambridge, I think. And he always used to tell stories about his professors back in the UK. And for anybody who had a tape recorder running at the time, he'd say, okay, turn it off. So he could say what he wanted to say without getting himself in a lot of trouble. And then he always would tell folks to put it back on. But one of his stories, one of his cleaner stories, was about this young graduate student who was ready to go overseas. You know, cultural anthropologists, they tend to go someplace for at least a year, live with the community for the course of a year so they can see all the different rituals and whatnot over the course of the year. And he was about to leave and he went to his professor and he's going, what am I going to do? What if I can't learn the language? What if I can't, what if people don't like me? You know, what am I going to do? And he received a 1-word answer: count. And that's really a good lesson for anybody doing research. If nothing, I wouldn't use count, I'd say measure. If nothing else, measure. If you don't know anything else, measure. Start off measuring. And so when I first started working on bridges in general and covered bridges, one of the things I did was I created a database. Every bridge I could find that had information on it. You know, its length, its width, you know, how many spans, what type of truss work, materials, etc. And so I was able to, I still have that data. In fact, I even have it on a one of those dot matrix printouts, as well as having it digitally. But you can see some of the different, more common truss types on the left: the average length, the average width, and the number of them that happen to be in my database. But you can see the Burr arch trusses are the most common in this database. And I think that's partly because those large arches were, you know, robust. They have stood the test of time. The Howe truss bridges only three. And that's probably because they were used mostly by railroads eventually. And the railroad companies, as they developed larger rolling stock, needed bigger bridges, so they replaced those. The town truss bridges, surprisingly not as common as I thought, but more common than the Howe and the Warren trusses. King post, queen post, there are quite a few of those in the sample, and I suspect that's because we can look at the average length. They're really short. And so because there's such short spans, they don't take a lot of abuse, and they're probably not getting a lot of traffic. They survive because they're almost inconsequential. And I suspect most of them that survive do so in parks, in places where they're not used for traffic anymore. They're just part of the setting. And people walk across them and everything that, whoever maintains the park maintains the bridge. They're a charming landscape feature, but don't actually function as bridges anymore. Or if they do, it's just as footbridges. So that's, you can get stuff like that. Just have a look at those books I mentioned earlier, the database I mentioned. You can actually extract data like that and start playing with it. The trusses, again, basic types we see. What's the earliest? What's the average date? And what's the latest? So you look at the dates here. The town trusses tend to be the earliest. Average date of 1866, latest 1910. And then see Burr truss early as well. And the rest of them sort of come around more the second quarter of the 19th century. But look at the latest dates: 1889, 1910, 1962, 1971, 1919. These bridges are still with us. And some of them are built as kind of retro things, but retro kind of something romantic, something that's as much an aesthetic thing as something that's actually functional. But there were a number of bridges built in the South in the 1920s and the 1930s out of timber, covered bridges. And you got to go, well, that's pretty late. Why were they doing that then? So who designed covered bridges? I just have a few folks here because I can't get images of most of them. They're like really dead. So they're hard to find. But this is Ithiel Towne, who started out kind of, he really wanted to be an architect, and that's what he became. Although he patented designs in 1820 and 1835, he really saw himself as an architect. He studied in Europe, but as a youth, he saw the issue of bridges and what it really took to build something that would last. And he developed this very simple model, which is basically throwing a lot of wood at the problem. Light frame members, you don't need heavy timbers for the truss. I mean, you can almost build something like this out of 2x4s, 2x6s or 2x8s, probably more likely. And that solved the problem of handling heavy loads. But he really made his name in architecture, particularly Greek Revival style architecture. William Howe, again, his design involved those iron vertical rods that were used largely by the railroad industry. Very few of his survived. And then here's our guy, Major Long, eventually Colonel Long, I think. But he designed this bridge. He was trained, I think he was a West Pointer. I'm not sure. But he trained as a military engineer. And so he was probably the first covered bridge builder, designer to bring modern engineering to the problem, figuring out what the stresses were, what's the nature of the materials we're going to build with, what are the dimensions we need those materials to be able to address the stresses on that bridge. And what he did, kind of interesting, is he took wooden wedges of different sizes, and he would actually stick them up at the top here. And so driving that wedge in increased the compression, the pre-stressing, if you will, of the timbers. And so he was able to adjust these bridges to handle heavier loads. And the Paddleford truss, I haven't been able to find a picture of Peter Paddleford, but his was basically a Howe truss, but he put in these longer counter braces that he notched into the wood. So it was the wood, the different elements more adequately work together. He never patented the design, is my understanding, partly because heirs of Major Long were arguing that this is just a long truss and he hadn't done anything special. And yet they're fairly common in New England. In fact, this is an example of one of these, and it lacks the sort of regularity of a truss lattice work. It's just the different angles and everything of the wood give it a little more movement, make it not as neat and rational, but there's enough pattern there that it's charming. And you notice a little teardrop, architectural features they've added to it. This has got a very Gothic revival type of flavor to it. You'll also notice the boards over here in the middle of the siding just beginning to rot away there. But the covering does not go all the way up to the eaves. So this bridge is very well lit. And judging from what I see here, it's no longer open to vehicular traffic. These look like not only bollards to prevent vehicles from going through, but serving as benches as well. So that does bring us to portholes and coverings. This out of the way here. This is a Schuylkill Bridge in Philadelphia, built in 1805, replaced 1850. Here you can see the multiple king posts, but you also see these underlying arches, almost presaging the Burr arch, except the arch isn't within the truss work, it's below it. And it's pre-stressed, but you can see that weight comes down on these arches and is transmitted to these very substantial piers and abutments. The river is fairly wide, at Philadelphia, and you need a fairly large bridge, a lot of traffic too. It is not covered at this point. If you look below, there's this little inset here which showed what it looked like after it was actually covered. So this was a view of the bridge. It had opened, but in fact had not been completed. It does raise the question of why do you cover a bridge? And we'll see a little bit of that when we look at their distributions. Here's a bridge that isn't covered at all. And it's a very different kind of truss. It's that inverted, sort of almost like a suspension bridge, except instead of cables here, these are big chains. These are lengths of chain that are probably 4 feet, sort of like a bicycle chain, only kind of longer. A lot of our early suspension bridges were not built with cables, with wound cables. They were built with these basically oversized bicycle chains. But it also has these iron rods, these braces that take up a lot of the stress. The wood seems to be there mostly to hold up the roof, which is probably why this thing isn't covered. It's because the iron was able to manage the weather quite well. They weren't worried about rot. I would love to be able to read what this little sign on the signs on the post say. Again, a lot of bridges, even the iron truss bridges you'll see around today, often have a manufacturer's plaque on it that tells you the name of the bridge, who designed it, who built it, and when it was constructed. In terms of portholes, you could see and covering, you can see from Sloan's drawings, there's a lot of variability there. You got this sort of I don't know what you'd call it. I used to know what it was called. But sort of almost a Western frontier kind of look to it. This one here in the middle is somewhat Italianate style of 1860s to 1880s in this part of the world. You can see this one here on the far right. It's covered up so much, it doesn't seem to be any windows in it. So it was probably a fairly dark bridge, but it's also a single span. It probably wasn't very long. This one on the lower right is a classic example of a double barrel covered bridge. So you have really two roadways that are separated to allow traffic to go both ways simultaneously. This in Virginia. And then here in New York, you've got this Burr arch truss with, it's hard to figure out what's going on, whether this is multiple king post or not, but it's a Burr arch. It comes down again below the floor and ties into the abutment down here. But it's only half clad. Why, I don't know. It'd be interesting to find that out because that exposes all this woodwork to the weather. It also has some sort of odd structure here too, which I'm not sure what that's about. So if I were, living in New York again, I might spend a little time researching the Esperance Bridge just to find out what this is all about. Why the difference? So here's the geography. And these are existing covered bridges. We don't have a map of covered bridges that no longer exist, although that would be a very interesting contribution to the study of these things. But you can see we've got over on the West Coast, not that many in California, I guess. I suspect most of these are for industry, for forestry, or mining, and the same thing as you go up the West Coast. Then there's this big void in the middle till you hit the Mississippi River. And you get a bunch of them in the Midwest, mostly in Ohio and into Pennsylvania. You got the mid-Atlantic area, New York, Pennsylvania, the very northern parts of Delaware and Maryland. And then you've got New England. And then look at this strip down through here, through the south. Most of those bridges are up probably in the mountains. And the coastal plain, virtually right up through Maryland. No bridges, no covered bridges. Be clear here. Let's get closer. Yeah, here we go. So what is going on here? Why are there no bridges on the coastal plain? Why are they up in the mountains? Why are they up in the northern Midwest, New York, and New England? I think the reason they're covering the bridges is not because of rain. I think they're covering the bridges because of ice. Because whether snow or rain gets in amongst the joints, and really cold weather, that water turns to ice. And as it turns to ice, it expands. And as it expands, it pulls joints apart. I suspect that's what's going on. So down the coastal plain from the Mason-Dixon line down, that ice is not as much of a problem, unless you're going up in elevation to the mountains or to the northern part of Maryland. So I think, I hadn't read anything about this so far, but I think that's largely what the covered bridge is about. It's about protecting these things from snow and ice. Hence, we don't see them in warmer climes. We have an example. I think there are only 3 covered bridges that survive in Maryland. One of them is up at Jerusalem Mill in Harford County. It's a relatively small short Burr arch bridge, still used by automobiles. I've driven across it. But it's getting up towards the northern part of the state, and I don't know. Maybe that's why it's there. But you could see this. You go drive to it today. Again, it's got these king posts, and it's got this sort of 2-part Burr arch truss on each side that handles most of the load. Still has a wooden deck and makes a lot of noise when automobiles drive across it. And it's painted the classic barn red. Mostly because, back then you could have your bridge or your schoolhouse in any color as long as it was red. because it was made with red lead paint. That's what was available. It was good as a preservative for bridges, probably not for our health.
Hey, Jim. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. We have just a few minutes left. It's 7:58, so I wanted to give you a
Okay.
heads up.
I'm just finishing up now.
All
So
right.
up on the gunpowder in north side of Baltimore, there was a covered bridge. It was destroyed in 1895. Oh, come on. Replaced by this structure. You can see the old factory. Another typo. See the old, I think that's a cotton mill in the background. And this is the bridge that's there today, which there may well be torn down in the near future. It's kind of a rickety bridge. Did some archaeology around it a couple of years ago. But that's part of the reason why these bridges don't, why they're not built anymore, is they were replaced by metal bridges. And built by metal bridges, partly because we had all these steel companies that were making rolling stock for railroads and railroad rails into the late 19th century, to the point where we didn't need that much material anymore. We didn't need that much more rolling stock. The rails were built. And so these steel companies turned their eyes toward making bridges. And they started manufacturing these bridges and building them all around the country, basically putting the covered bridge folks out of business. Okay, so these are the kinds of questions I would normally ask. Who decided where, when, and why, what type of bridge? You get into some interesting social history when you do that. The 19th century seems to have been the era of the covered bridge, going somewhat into the 20th century. And it's probably, again, the steel industry that put them out of business. They just create a monopoly. So that's all I got. Entertain questions. Anybody gonna start studying these things?
You said there were 3 bridges in Maryland? You mentioned Jerusalem Mills.
Yeah, one is going up towards towards Blue Ball. I think that's in Cecil County. I can't remember where the third one was.
Okay.
But again, you go to lostbridges.org and you can just check that out. You can check the Maryland Historical Trust Medusa site too. I think they're all on there.
Great, thanks.
Any other
One
questions?
observation is the coastal plain may have had ferries.
Well, yeah, but ferries require that they be staffed and that you have to pay every time you cross. Well, there are
Right.
toll bridges. There are toll bridges too, of course. Nice thing about a bridge is it's passive. You don't, I mean, you need somebody, well, you don't even need the snow shoveled if it's covered. Ferry requires that there be somebody there. You get paid. You have to wait till the ferry comes back from the other side, or wait till the guy gets back from dinner or sobers up or whatever. Bridges made a lot more sense and more. They fit into the developing turnpike system, which I didn't talk about at all, much better than ferries would have.
Thanks.
Sure.
That bridge you showed in Philadelphia, I think that's the one that Thomas Paine tried to replace. Thomas Paine actually designed a single arch iron bridge. And the problem was, I'm not sure if it was that bridge or another one going across the Schuylkill, kept getting wiped out by ice flows.
Yeah.
And he wanted to get it across so that there was no obstruction
Yeah.
between.
That's the main problem. And actually, that's why the suspension bridge is really the best solution to bridging nowadays, is because you don't block the navigable channel, even though there's not that much commercial traffic on rivers these days outside the major ports. With ice flows and everything, they're just a lot easier to maintain. Yeah. And compared to a lot of the bridges we build, suspension bridges look a lot nicer. Some of those steel through truss bridges just look awful.